In all of my years advocating for and talking about public transport systems, one thing has come up again and again. A certain obsession with public transit making money. This is a topic that many people who are opposed to public transit like to complain about. Oh, your local transit agency is not even profitable. It's also something that people who are weirdly obsessed with public transportation making money like to sing from the rooftops. But can public transportation actually make money? And perhaps more importantly, should it? If you're new here, my name is Reece and I make videos about public transportation. So, can transit be profitable? Absolutely. A lot of things can be profitable. Transportation services are run by profitable companies all over the place, from airports to downtown shuttle circulators. But we really are talking about full public transportation systems here, right? Well, I think the natural place to look then, and the place that a lot of people will obviously bring up, is Hong Kong, with its famously excellent MTR system that not only runs fast, efficient trains across the city, but also makes money and sells transportation operations services to places around the world, from Sydney to London. I have no disagreements about the excellence of the MTR, but in Hong Kong at least, they make a lot of their money from property development. And there's a big issue here. Hong Kong has an insanely and famously hot and unaffordable housing market. That's not to mention the fact that land isn't actually owned by individuals or companies, but simply leased to them by the government for fixed periods of time. The MTR is still a relatively young rapid transit system. It's newer than a system like the New York subway or the London Underground, not to even mention a system like the Toronto subway. You can sort of imagine how all of that concrete and all of that infrastructure could get a lot more expensive to maintain a few decades down the road, and might hurt the MTR's profitability. Now, to be completely fair, places with much more traditional property ownership laws are starting to take lessons from Hong Kong, developing property which can then fund the expansion and operation of the transportation system. For example, London or Vancouver. But you might notice something. These are also places with famously unaffordable housing, so I'm not entirely sure that they're the type of place that the average city should be emulating. Now, it's worth mentioning that some other systems out there, like Go Transit and the Toronto Transit Commission, are quite famously close to breaking even on their operations. Before the pandemic completely upended travel patterns, both systems made nearly 80% of their revenue from passengers paying their fare. And it's not impossible to see how, with some changes to the way these systems operate, they could get close to 100%, maybe even make money. And while it's completely fair to look at these systems and how they are quite impressively efficient in their operations, it's also worth pointing out that there are some catches. In Go's case, they essentially receive a lot of subsidy through giant free parking garages. These aren't for the most part an operating cost for Go Transit, but they allow people to drive to stations, effectively meaning Go doesn't need to provide costly or last mile transportation. Even building the garages in the first place is an incredibly costly proposition, where the average car stall costs more than the average car. With the TTC and other subway and rapid transit systems around the world, you might hear people say things like, the subway is profitable, but this is just sort of ridiculous. Sure, in a vacuum the subway might be making money, but it's a transportation system. The subway doesn't have passengers to make money from if buses, which tend to not be profitable, don't deliver them. At the same time, the TTC has the benefit of serving just a portion of the Toronto region, the densest portion, and a portion that already sees people being fed into it by external transit agencies who have worse cost recovery, in part because of lower density land uses, but also in part because they don't have an electric rail system like the TTC. The TTC itself might not fare so well if they had to serve the lower density and perhaps even rural parts of the region. It's not that that wouldn't be a laudable goal, but it's just silly to talk about profitability of an individual service within a larger transportation network. It's sort of like being very good at underwater basket weaving. Now, of course, there are systems and services which are profitable. Japanese systems would probably be some of the first that people would bring up. And of course, the historic rail networks of New York City and London were built by private companies, albeit they're not around anymore, which can tell you something. The issue is broadly, when you look at these systems, government almost always plays a role. For example, in Japan, a lot of rail capital funding comes from the government, and in the cases of London and New York, governments had to give companies permission to build their rapid transit lines, which they sometimes got near monopolies on. Now, of course, it's probably possible that some company actually is making money, but I would ask if that company couldn't be diverting the money it's making to actually just providing a better service. You see, in most cases where a transit system seems to be doing something miraculous to make money, there's a catch. And this just highlights the fact that if you have a narrow enough scope and special enough circumstances, anything is possible. In a world where Taylor Swift doesn't exist and I grew up in Nashville, I too might be a successful country pop star. But that's not the world we live in. Of course, with the right conditions, transit could be a profitable, self-sustaining business, but should that actually be our goal? Profit is just revenue minus costs, and even among the best transit systems in the world, I don't see a single service that couldn't charge less to expand access or provide better service. For example, at night, where many of those great systems in East Asia in particular tend to not really operate. Another thing that frequently comes up when I talk about Japanese rail systems is the fact that fares tend to not be all that well integrated. That might be fine with you, but the better system is to have integrated fares, but that might eat into profits. Ultimately, I think it's worth considering all of this through a broader transportation lens. We don't expect roads to make money. We understand that society has to pay for them, but that we will get benefits from them, at least up until a point. City Nerd made an excellent video about Highway 401 recently. I'll link it up here. It talks about these issues a lot more. So I think the real question that we should be asking, and that the question of transit profitability is asking, is what's the lowest cost method of transportation for society that provides the most benefit? And I would argue in most cases that's public transportation. Of course, every society is going to need some basic roads. City services need to be deployed, and some people's jobs require them to have a work van or truck. But beyond a basic road network, public transportation systems provide all of the benefits of an expansive road network without many of the downfalls. And if you're a fiscal hawk, public transportation is just way more cost effective. A diesel bus in Canada costs about $700,000, while the average new car is about $25,000. That means that if you put 28 people on a bus and say, you don't need to buy cars anymore, you've already paid for the bus in money that didn't need to be spent on cars, and buses can move more than 28 people. At the same time, while the average car in Canada has a lifespan of around 10 years, the average bus has a lifespan of 15. Now, of course, you do have to pay a driver for a bus, albeit drivers for buses are safer than typical drivers. They're better trained professionals. And at the same time, the fuel you have to put into the bus, well, that's a lot more efficient too. Not only is the bus's engine just far more efficient than the engines of 28 plus cars, but buses don't spend most of their time sitting in parking lots. Of course, maintaining public transport vehicles is also much more efficient, since a small team of experienced mechanics work on the same exact vehicle day in and day out, becoming extremely knowledgeable and effective at repairing these exact vehicles. And of course, buses and other public transport vehicles need a lot less road space, not to mention parking space, a cost which is generally just borne by private businesses and individuals. So you can already start to see, just by comparing the costs of cars and buses and looking at the individual efficiencies of their operation, how public transportation can just be so much more cost effective than driving. And how the costs of public transportation aren't stratospheric. It's just a better deal for society. And of course, you still need to build some roads and parking, but every bit less road and parking lot you need to build is money saved for society and better cities for everyone. And it's worth mentioning that bus service is the least cost-effective public transport mode by passenger moved. Rail modes, especially electric rail operating above ground, are incredibly cost-effective. Building an above-ground double-track electric rail alignment should not be substantially more expensive than building a large road. And since a train can have a single driver and move hundreds, if not over 1,000 people, it's far more cost-effective to operate than buses. And because electric trains have far more solid-state components, and because their design life tends to be measured in decades rather than years, they're way more cost-effective in their life cycle costs as well. So in the optimal case, a busy transit system converts its busiest bus routes, already more efficient than providing road space for people to drive themselves, to rail routes, which become more efficient, allowing capital to be reallocated to better service, lower fares, and more access. And I haven't even gotten into the externalities, the costs which you don't directly incur but which are felt by society, both positively with public transportation and negatively with driving. For example, the costs of all of the car crashes that happen when people get around primarily by car are enormous. Just look at how large the car insurance industry is. That's not to mention the public health impacts of all of the tire and brake dust, or the sedentary lifestyles that cars tend to encourage, since you can get straight into your car from your house and drive straight to your workplace, no walking involved. And then there's the fact that car infrastructure, being so space inefficient, eats up tons of green space in our cities. On the other hand, good public transportation is accessible, not just to the type of people who can have a driver's license, but to anyone. And unlike with driving, for the most part, you don't get a better experience by paying more money. Everyone from every strata of society gets access to the same excellent transportation. And that has huge benefits for society and economic development. Now you might be saying, well, my city isn't designed for public transportation, something which I discussed in a recent reaction video, and that's okay. Even if just a part of your city can start to be more public transit friendly, or even if a portion of your population can go car free, the benefits are still huge, since every car that we don't have on the road is another car crash we avoid, pollution that we can prevent, and a person who can get on public transportation more often. And at the same time, government has the levers. Government can change how land use works and encourage modes of transportation that aren't just better for society, but cost less money. And it's critical to remember that public transportation is just one part of the equation. If people can walk and cycle to their final destination, that's both better for their health and even lower cost, allowing transit to focus on the routes where demand is greatest and allowing people to avoid owning expensive cars. So while transit can absolutely be profitable, it shouldn't be, because there's no perfect transit system that couldn't stand to improve its service, or reduce its fares, or expand its scope. We don't expect sewers to make money, and we shouldn't expect the local bus to either. Thanks for watching.